Episode 29. The Price of Dawn. Elena stood in the Convergence chamber beneath Stormwatch Palace, surrounded by dying wards and the evidence of deliberate sabotage, and tried to convince herself there might be another way. She'd been trying for 3 hours. The chamber was vast, larger than Thornhaven's Grand Hall, carved from living stone by ancient mages who'd understood that some workings required space to breathe. The floor was inscribed with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, lines of power that had once channeled the kingdom's defensive magic through this central node. Now those lines flickered with sickly light, corrupted from within by Magister Brennan's precise sabotage. Elena had mapped every carved weakness, documented every deliberate flaw. She'd spent hours with her magical sight open, tracing the corruption back through the ley lines to find its source. The mathematics were elegant in their cruelty. Brennan had created a breach that conventional magic couldn't close, a wound in reality itself that would only widen as magisters tried to reinforce it. She'd examined every theoretical approach, tried to calculate whether a working circle of sufficient size might generate enough power, considered whether the remaining uncorrupted ley lines could be redirected to bypass the compromised channels, even contemplated whether King Edric's corruption might somehow be reversed, though she knew better. Every path led to the same conclusion. The breach was trying to free the Voidweaver, not Cassian's sealed version. The original entity, still partially imprisoned beneath the Shadowvale wastes, reaching through the weakness Brennan had created. If it succeeded, the cascade through the continental ley line network would destabilize every wardstone from here to Thornhaven, including Cassian's ceiling. 57 years would become 30, 20, 10, maybe less. You're still here. Elena turned to find King Edric in the chamber entrance, one hand braced against the doorframe. The corruption had spread further in just 3 hours. Dark veins now traced his jaw, crept toward his left eye. He had days left at most. Possibly only hours. Your Majesty? Elena straightened, though exhaustion made her bones ache. You should be resting. I'll rest soon enough. He moved into the chamber with careful steps, each one measured against his failing strength. Permanently. The question is whether my kingdom rests with me. Elena said nothing. What could she say? That she'd found no solution? That conventional magic was useless? That the only answer was the same terrible sacrifice Cassian had made? Edric studied the corrupted ley lines with eyes that had seen too much. Ambassador Wintermere told me about your friend, the one who became a prison. Cassian? His name hurt to speak. He held the Voidweaver for what should have been 3 centuries. Now my kingdom's collapse threatens to shorten that timeline. Edric's voice was steady despite the corruption consuming him. How much time does he have left? 57 years. Maybe 30 if the network destabilizes completely. Elena met his gaze. That's why I came, not just to save the Eastern Reach, to save him. By doing what he did. It wasn't a question. Elena's hand moved to the leather satchel at her side, where Seraphina's journals waited with their terrible knowledge. There's a technique, theoretical. It requires everything, Edric finished. I know. I've read the sealed archives. Every king of the Eastern Reach studies them, hoping we'll never face circumstances desperate enough to require such knowledge. He smiled without humor. Hoping is easier than preparing. He moved deeper into the chamber, approaching the convergence point where the ley lines intersected. The corrupted patterns pulsed around him, responding to his presence with sickly eagerness. I tried to reinforce the wards at Ironhold, he said quietly. Conventional working. 200 magisters in perfect synchronization, pushing power through the network to strengthen what remained. It should have worked. The mathematics were sound, the execution flawless. But the channels were already compromised, Elena said, understanding. You were feeding power directly into the breach. My entire working circle died in 4 minutes. Edric's voice remained steady, but Elena heard the weight beneath it. I watched them burn from the inside out as corruption flooded back through the connection. Felt it enter me as I tried to shut down the working. Too late to save them, barely fast enough to save myself. He turned to face her, and Elena saw the king beneath the corruption, a man who'd ruled for 30 years, who'd tried to protect his people through strength and wisdom and tradition, who'd believed that doing things the right way would be enough. 30,000 people have died in the last month, Edric said. 7 cities fallen, 3 more on the brink. And I stand here dying, knowing that conventional magic failed because someone sabotaged us from within. Magister Brennan, Elena's voice hardened. He carved precise weaknesses into the ley line structure, created a deliberate breach. This wasn't natural failure. It was murder. Murder on a continental scale. Edric looked at the corrupted patterns surrounding them. The question is whether he worked alone or had allies, whether other kingdoms faced similar sabotage, whether this was isolated treachery or coordinated attack. Elena had been thinking the same thing during her examination. The sabotage was too sophisticated for one magister working alone. The weaknesses too precisely placed to be discovered through simple study. Brennan had known exactly where to strike and how to ensure conventional reinforcement would fail. Someone had taught him. Someone with deep knowledge of forbidden magic and ley line architecture. Someone who wanted the Voidweaver free. I can seal the breach, Elena said. The words tasted like ash. Using the technique in Seraphina's journals. It requires corrupting myself, consuming the Voidweaver's essence at the convergence point, and becoming a living prison. Like Cassian, like the 73 who came before him. Edric studied her with eyes that had sentenced criminals, negotiated treaties, buried children. How long would you last? 3 centuries, if I'm strong enough, if I can maintain my identity that long. Elena's laugh was bitter. Cassian is already forgetting who he was after only 4 months. I watched him lose the taste of wine, the smell of rain. Soon he'll forget his sister's name, his own name. Everything that made him Cassian Netherbane will dissolve into the collective consciousness holding the Voidweaver. And you would accept that fate? I don't know. The admission hurt. I promised his sister I'd find a way to save him that didn't require anyone else to give everything. I promised myself I wouldn't become what Seraphina almost became, someone so consumed by forbidden knowledge that the line between necessity and desire blurs completely. Elena pulled out Seraphina's journals, the leather covers worn from her constant study during the journey. She documented everything. First-tier corruption techniques that require minor self-sacrifice. Second-tier that demand more but remain survivable. Third-tier anathema class that require everything. She opened to the final pages, where Seraphina's handwriting grew increasingly erratic. She developed a technique to free Cale Thornweave by trading places with him, becoming his prison so he could be free. She practiced corruption magic for years, learning how to make herself a vessel, nearly lost herself in the process. But she didn't use it, Edric said, reading the understanding in Elena's expression. No, she chose to walk away, to build a life instead of throwing it away. She decided that trading one prison for another solved nothing, just created an endless cycle of people burning themselves out to hold back darkness. Elena closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. I've spent 4 months studying Cassian's corruption, learning to read it as language. I know exactly how the technique works, what it costs, what I'll become. And you came here anyway, because 30,000 people are dead. Because if the Eastern Reach falls, Cassian's ceiling destabilizes. Because someone has to. She stopped, drew a breath, made herself say it. Because I don't know if there's another way. Edric moved to the convergence point where the corrupted ley lines pulsed with sickly light. He knelt slowly, his corrupted body protesting the movement, and placed both palms flat against the stone. There isn't, he said quietly. I've consulted every scholar, examined every historical precedent, tried every conventional approach. The breach is too sophisticated, too precisely calculated. Brennan designed it to be unsealable through normal means. He looked up at Elena, and she saw acceptance in his eyes, the kind that came after exhausting every alternative. But I'm already dying, Edric said. Already corrupted, already lost. So let me do it. Elena's breath caught. Your Majesty, I have perhaps 3 days left, possibly only hours if I use magic again, but you. He gestured to her with one corrupted hand. You're young, uncorrupted. You have a life ahead of you, someone waiting for you to return. Cassian. He meant Cassian. The technique requires an uncorrupted vessel, Elena said, her voice hoarse. Someone whose essence structure is intact enough to be systematically corrupted and reshaped. Your corruption is too advanced, too chaotic. You'd burn out before completing the working. She'd checked. Spent an hour examining the requirements, hoping desperately that King Edric's existing corruption might somehow make him suitable. But the technique was precise. It required controlled, deliberate corruption, not the wild backlash he'd suffered. Then we're back where we started. Edric rose slowly, each movement careful, with you as the only option. Unless Brennan had allies who know another way, Elena said. Unless there's something in the sealed archives we haven't found. Unless you're searching for excuses to delay the inevitable. Edric's voice was gentle but firm. I recognize the pattern, Keeper. I've been doing the same thing for 3 days. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist there had to be another way. But she'd spent 3 hours examining every possibility, and the mathematics were merciless. The breach was widening. Shadow spawn were manifesting throughout the city. The wards were failing faster with each passing hour, and she was running out of time. Dawn, she said finally. I'll search until dawn. 6 more hours to find an alternative. Examine every option. Exhaust every possibility. And then, Elena met his gaze. Then I use the technique. Corrupt myself. Consume the Void Weaver's essence. Become a prison. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. I should send word to Thornhaven, Edric said. Let them know what you're attempting. Ensure your sacrifice isn't lost to history the way so many others have been. No. Elena's voice was sharp. Not until after. If I fail, there's no point in telling them. If I succeed, if she succeeded, she'd be frozen in temporal stasis for 3 centuries. Conscious but trapped. Slowly losing her memories, her identity, everything that made her Elena Brightwater. Just like Cassian. Liana, she said quietly. Cassian's sister. She's maintaining the vigil in Thornhaven. She'll need to know. She'll need to. Elena's throat closed. Liana was 14 years old. She'd already lost her brother to the ceiling. Now she'd lose Elena too. Would spend the next 3 centuries as keeper of 2 prisons, reading memories to consciousnesses that were slowly forgetting who they'd been. I'll ensure she knows, Edric promised. I'll make certain both sacrifices are remembered. He moved toward the chamber entrance, then paused. For what it's worth, Keeper, I'm sorry. Sorry that my kingdom's crisis forces this choice. Sorry that conventional magic proved insufficient. Sorry that wisdom and strength and tradition weren't enough. They never are, Elena said. Not against enemies who break the rules. Not against sabotage from within. Not against existential threats that require existential responses. Edric nodded slowly and left her alone in the Convergence chamber. Elena returned to her examination of the corrupted ley lines, though she knew she'd find nothing new. She'd already documented every detail, calculated every variable, explored every theoretical approach. But she had 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours to search desperately for a solution that didn't require her to become a living prison. 6 hours to hope for a miracle. Because that's what Cassian would have done. She pulled out her notebook, the same one where she documented Cassian's core memories, his fears about forgetting Liana's name, his desperate attempts to hold on to his humanity. Now she began writing her own memories, her own fears, her own desperate hope that someone would remember who she'd been. Elena Brightwater, age 22, keeper of Thornhaven, trained in magical theory and leyline architecture, loves historical research and morning coffee. Promised Liana she'd find a way to save Cassian. Failed. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but she forced herself to continue. If she was going to do this, when she did this, someone needed to remember. Someone needed to read these words back to her when she'd forgotten her own name. Outside the chamber, she heard distant screams. Shadow spawn manifesting as the wards continued to fail. People dying while she sat here documenting memories. 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours to find an alternative. 6 hours to prepare for a sacrifice that would last 300 years. Elena Brightwater opened Seraphina's journals to the corruption techniques and began to study in earnest. Not searching for alternatives anymore. Searching for the precise steps she'd need to follow. The exact sequence of corruption. The specific working that would transform her from human to prison. Because she already knew there was no other way. She'd known it since the moment she'd discovered Brennan's sabotage, Known it since she'd calculated the breach's expansion rate. Known it since she'd realized that conventional magic would only feed more power into the wound. The 6 hours weren't about finding an alternative. They were about accepting the inevitable, about saying goodbye to Elena Brightwater before she became something else entirely. She thought of Cassian, frozen in Thornhaven's Grand Hall, slowly forgetting who he'd been. Thought of his 9-pulse sequence she still didn't understand. Thought of his promise to fight to come back as himself. Had he succeeded? Or had Cassian Netherbane already dissolved into the collective consciousness, leaving only the prison behind? She'd know soon enough. In 6 hours, she'd begin the same journey. Elena returned to her studies, memorizing the corruption sequences, preparing her essence for systematic destruction. The chamber grew colder as she worked, as if the stone itself recognized what was coming. Somewhere above, the sun was setting on her last day as Elena Brightwater. Dawn would rise on something else entirely.
Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures. Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures.